Anyone ever found a body? What's that like? I found my dad's body after he killed himself last year. He was lying face down on his bed, so the blood had pooled down to his stomach and face, making him almost unrecognizable. His face was smooshed in, and his body was mottled blue, as he had killed himself during the night. It was an overdose. He mixed bottles of pills, oxycodone, Flexeril, Ativan, amitriptyline, and more, with alcohol and stopped breathing. I'll never forget time slowing down and feeling as if I wasn't there. I have severe anxiety and have dissociated before, but the dissociation that hits you when you experience trauma like this is truly something else. I knew he was dead, but my mind wasn't letting me acknowledge it. I was apparently screaming, and I don't remember doing so. I tried to wake him up. I called to him and touched his shoulders and accidentally stepped in the puddle where he had peed himself. Feeling how stiff and cold his body was jarring. I was still in shock, but I remember it finally semi-clicking in my brain that he was dead the moment I touched him. I called emergency services, but don't remember the process of doing so. My dad had been suicidal for years, and I was used to taking care of him during his drug and alcohol binges. As such, I had been mentally preparing myself for this moment for years. He had tried to mutilate and shoot himself a year before, and I'd cleaned his blood then. I had even worked crime and trauma scene cleanup for a few years. I've seen terrible things. I've cleaned blood, brain matter, bone, and more, but finding my own dad dead shocked me so much that I finally blacked out as he was wheeled away. I ended up having to clean everything up again, even after I had made my dad promise me he'd never do this to me again. Nothing will ever completely prepare you for losing a loved one or finding a body. No matter how much you may think you're desensitized or used to it, or think you may be okay, in the end nobody knows how they will react. To this day, my family's screams of anguish are what I remember the most from that day. The absolute worst part is the guilt and shame that rocks through you. You wonder if there was something you could have done to save them. You wonder if they'd still be alive if only you had done X or Y. Over a year later, and I'm still suffering these thoughts. I would never wish this on anyone. Well, this is fucking depressing. Yes, my sister. Almost immediately knew she was gone and felt so detached from what I was seeing. Almost like I wasn't even seeing her as my sister and just hollow death. Think it was just my way of coping with what I was seeing and not really accepting just how awful it was. It was a really cold experience. Totally numbing, and my senses just shut off. I was way more apathetic than I'd expect. Hyper focused on remaining calm and collected in how I responded. The sinking feeling of reality started to kick in when emergency responders took over. Absolute depression. Eventually lost it when things got quiet. Found my ex-girlfriend's brother shot in the face and found my neighbor who had been dead for 3 days from an overdose. I don't go to funerals anymore. We found a body washed up in the rocks on the beach. I was taking photos of vultures because they were sitting on the rocks and they were pretty large. I first saw his distended stomach and followed it down to his foot. I grabbed my husband and said, "That's a body." "Is that a body?" "Oh my gosh, that's a body." After double checking, we walked away to call 911. Checking a third time, from a different angle, I saw some of his skull missing and the unmistakable human hand. Somehow, we were able to get cell service long enough to tell the 911 dispatcher which state park we were in. Ambulance, firefighters, state police, a Coast Guard helicopter, truck, and boat all showed up. It was amazing to watch. They carried him up in a body bag, placed him on the asphalt, and left him there for 30 minutes. It was just another day to first responders. Oddly, we are thankful to have found him, because he was on part of the beach no one ever crosses a river to get to. The tide was coming in when he was pulled out. Had we not found him when we found him, the crabs and vultures would have finished him off. His family would have never had answers. I don't know his name or anything other than what we witnessed. We are fine. Our trauma of finding a body is nothing compared to what his family would have endured, never knowing what happened to him. What a caring and compassionate outlook on such a sad event. When I was much younger, say 02 or so, my father belonged to a private hunting lease that was well off the beaten path to get to. The entrance had a locked swinging gate made of 3-inch steel pipe welded together, and the only people with keys were those that had paid to hunt the lease. We live in the deep south of Louisiana, where hurricanes are a common occurrence, and on this particular day we were heading back into the woods to set up a new deer stand post-storm. My pops drove a tiny white Nissan truck and we were pulling a trailer with materials to build and a 3-wheeler. The spot he picked out was a mile or so past the gate, down a gravel road about 9 feet wide, and another half mile or so into the woods. As expected, the storm had left many branches and brush across the road, so my job was to ride in the bed and hop out, to move shit as needed, and get eaten alive by horseflies. We get 3/4 of the way in, and at this point the gravel road has swamp on both sides, and has narrowed to maybe 8 feet wide, and wouldn't you know it, a decent sized water oak is laying across the road. Being well above my pay grade, I grabbed the chainsaw for Pops to get to work, and notice what looked like a clothed mannequin covered in green algae in the water a few feet off the road. Pops spots it too, and goes to grab a 4x4 post to try and drag it closer to see WTF it is. At this point I just remember his demeanor changing, and he told me to get in the truck. This man unhooks the loaded trailer by hand and shoves it into the swamp. 36 point turns that truck around and drags the trailer back out and hooks it up. I'll never know how the hell he did that, but I saw it with my own 2 eyes. We book it out of there, and he's trying to call 911, but has no service. I'm still pretty clueless, but he tells me he thinks that was a real person. The craziest part is once we make it back to the gate, and he gets cell reception, he calls 911, and within minutes a deputy shows up and blocks the gate off. At that point a woman pulls up in a car asking to get back there, stating she was related to the landowners. Cop says no way etc etc. She leaves and we think nothing of it. More cops and the coroner show up, and my dad brings them back there to show them. Fast forward a few months, and it comes out that the guy was having some relations with a woman who happened to be the lesbian lover of another woman. When she found out, she murdered the guy and dumped his body back there. How did she have a key, you ask? She was related to the landowners. She was the woman who pulled up to the gate minutes after we got out and the first cop showed up. She had dumped him there because the tree that stopped us had blocked her from going any further into the woods. Add that to the fact that that was the one and only time my pops had gone there without bringing his rifle. Had we been 15 minutes later, she'd have been back there when we were, and who knows what would have happened. She was arrested months later and convicted. Interesting side note, I wound up working for a company over a decade later and randomly recounted the story to some guys in the office, and it turned out one of the guys was related to the deceased individual. Small world. When I was 8 I was walking with my dad and dogs deep in the woods and the dogs started barking at something at a distance. Bears and cougars were a possibility, so I was looking as hard as I could, and I saw a mannequin maybe 50 yards away. My dad said there's no way. One of the dogs kept barking at it from about half the distance between us and wouldn't come back. My dad went off the trail to retrieve the dog and shouted toward what I now could make out was a person. Hey there, sorry about my dog, I don't know what. He stopped, rushed back with the dog, and said we have to go home right now. At the time my ATO logic assumed that it must be a person he doesn't like from work or from the neighborhood or something, and he just didn't want to chat. We walked home fast and in silence and he went back out right away. A few hours later he came home with 2 police officers asking me about what I saw. I remember explaining that I thought it was a mannequin, but I realized it was a really quiet person. What I didn't know how to explain was that there was an absolute stillness about him. The officers didn't tell me then, and my dad didn't tell me until I was 16, but what I saw was a man who had hung himself. Twice. The first time, I was living in a major city and a pedestrian was apparently run over during the night. His body landed in front of my home, 2 houses down from where he was it. The second time, in another town, there was a dead man lying in my street. It was determined he was fighting with another guy and they were chasing each other through the streets. The deceased was stabbed. I used to work in self-storage, and when I left, a buddy of mine took over the property I used to manage. We took a weekend off from our respective jobs to go to Vegas a few years ago. He lived on site in a company apartment. When we got back late in the evening, he walked around his property as is pretty typical. There was a car park with someone in it. He knocked on the window and got no response. He called me and told me about it, and as I was close by, I told him I'd be right there. As I got close to the car, I could smell death. The car was locked and all the windows were fogged up inside. It was obvious that the person inside was dead. He called the police and they responded with fire and medical. Yeah, the guy was dead. Reviewing the security cameras showed him come in and park there about 36 hours earlier. It was an overdose. I don't think it was ever determined to be accidental or suicide. This will probably get buried at the bottom, but it helps me to talk about it. About 5 years ago I found my upstairs neighbor, Dave, dead. He had been rotting up there for at least 2 weeks. Here's a little backstory. Dave had a drinking problem. He was a chill, perma-drunk, divorced older white guy. He looked like he had given up on many things in his life. I sometimes would go down to the liquor store say on a Friday or weekend and I would invite Dave to come with me. 1. Because I didn't like when he would drive drunk to restock. He didn't work, or at least nothing steady. This was low income area apartments in Jersey. And 2. Because I enjoyed his company. I would hear Dave through my ceiling in my little apartment. He lived above me. Time went on, and I noticed his car was parked outside, yet no sign of Dave. My suspicion grew every day I returned home from work, because that's when I would usually run into Dave. I had knocked on his door a couple random times as well. Well, about 12 days go by, and I called up my apartment building front office and told them I was worried about Dave. They said they would call the police department for a wellness checkup on an elderly resident. I was worried, so I asked the office to keep me informed on my neighbor, and I was friends with them. I had a cool property management lady. I waited outside for the police. 2 of them showed up, and I was still in my military uniform and had just gotten home. They knocked on the door and announced they were the police. There was no answer. They got the key from the front office and announced they were going to enter the apartment. Before they opened the door and went inside to check on Dave, they told me I could wait outside, but I wanted to see Dave, my friend. Well, as soon as they opened that door, the smell just hit you. It was literally the worst smell I have ever smelled in my entire life. Vodka rotten human corpse stench is how I could put it. Dave had suffered a heart attack at his computer one night of heavy drinking. He lived alone and didn't have many friends or family that would check on him. I'm glad I had the decency to care about Dave, the neighborhood random drunk, because who knows how much longer he would have been up there until maybe they evicted him. Needless to say, the apartment upstairs got renovated and wasn't offered for rent for a few months, but 6 months later, and a couple moved in. I knew they were oblivious that Dave had died there. Worst thing about it was the female that moved and also managed to get a job at the front office, but they were under new management at that time. I moved once my lease was over. Came across a drunk driving accident. Probably happened a minute or 2 before we drove up to it, since no one else was there and it was on the highway. It was awful. Called the cops and went to see if we could help, but they were clearly dead. One had been ejected out of the windshield and was lying on the highway.